Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Laurel wash processed Honduras from Terraform Coffee Roasters. And there's the bag right there. And Terraform, based out of Shanghai, China. And this is their first ever appearance on this channel. This is a coffee roaster I had zero familiarity with going into this review. This is also our first ever review of any Chinese-based coffee roaster, as it was part of the Coffee Vines International subscription box. So as soon as I saw this coffee, it caught my attention for two reasons. The first of which being that we've never reviewed any Chinese-based coffee roaster, and the second being that it was a wash-processed coffee, so it felt like a perfect opportunity to finally review one. And we will see how it turned out, as this right here is day 60. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed out to 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. So this one did turn out a fair bit lighter than initially expected, and I feel like the best way to describe it is to kind of compare it with some of the other Asian-based countries, and that includes Korea, where this coffee was notably lighter than anything we've reviewed from Korea. And as far as Japanese-based coffee roasters, then I would say the only coffee roaster from Japan I've had that's been lighter is Apollon's Gold. So this one was actually a very light coffee by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 35, first impression, and we ran it through the V60, and as notated, the first thing I took away from this coffee was just how light it was, as not only when I opened up the coffee and took a look at the beans themselves, but in addition to that, after I brewed the coffee, I said, this is surprisingly light, as I've had some kind of mixed experiences with a lot of Asian-based coffee roasters, mostly because I don't have enough familiarity with the majority of them to really know what profile they're going to go with their coffees. So seeing this one being as light as it was a nice surprise for me, as it did offer a notable bit of sugary aspects right from the onset. Clean and straightforward with a slight bit of citrus and caramel, lending itself to an excellent first impression. We move on to day 38 as we opted for the Chemex, and it's offering more of the initial impressions from that first cup, as there's a slight bit more definition with plenty of the caramelized sugar sweetness. In addition to that, there's a lingering brightness that's complex, with it ranging from citrus to palm fruits as well, but also plenty of fruit sugariness as well in the finish, giving it just a little bit more depth. Day 41 opted for the April brewer, and it was mostly in line with a lot of the previous days, with some slightly more toned down aspects in terms of the overall intensity and vibrancy. Sugariness remains one of the most dominant factors, with more of the citric components at the end. Day 44 opted for the V60 with the Coffee Vines recipe, and that was kind of interesting. I said to myself, I'm having such wonderful success with the coffee up to this point, and the recipe is calling for 90 degrees, so it was toning this coffee down significantly. And as a result, it wasn't quite as good, as it did feel significantly more tame than a lot of the previous days. The sugariness also felt toned down in place of a much more soft citric forward cup, with some slight tea-like savoriness lending itself to an okay day. And I think it was still a very nice day, just relative to some of the experiences we'd had up to this point. I would say that it wasn't necessarily quite as good. Day 47 opted for the same recipe with the Chemex this time, and it once again felt a little bit more toned down and diluted relative to some of the earlier experiences. There was still plenty of sugariness regardless, as that was an ever-present theme within this coffee. The additional fruit brightness is less defined and intense, but the cup in general was still nice, and that's what I was referencing, was this coffee was still nice, even with it being a little bit more subtle and toned down. And day 50, back through the V60 with our standard recipe, and there has been a slight bit of a struggle with this coffee, as there's a little bit more of the intensity from the earlier days in that sugary sense, but at this time I would say that it felt a little bit more generic on the fruit aspects of it, with a slight bit of brightness lending itself to an okay day. And I did begin to wonder whether or not it might have been impacted by just all the transportation to get to us, as not only was it already at that day 50 mark, but it had to take the time to get from China to Europe to us, so I was wondering if that might have played a role in it. But on day 53, we went back through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and the cup was back to its best with more of the caramelized sugary aspects once again. Fruit brightness is back, and it's being offered in both the pomma and citric sense yet again, lending itself to a much better day. And day 56, final notes we have through the Chemex, and it continues to remain sugary sweet with fruit brightness and a savory tea-like aspect. And I ran out of space for notes, so that's the way we're going to leave that. And let's go ahead and transition to the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. So this one right here was certainly a very clean coffee, and right from the onset I could tell that this one was going to be a very clean one. And I would say that it came in a number of different ways, mostly because I want to say the definition was very notable, but the cup itself was a little bit more tame and delicate, kind of allowing it to offer a better defined profile to a lot of those coffees. And I think maybe the profile of this one had a lot to do with that, as this one right here was certainly a clean coffee. Finish level 4, and as mentioned, that came a lot in the more sugary, caramelized sugar sort of finish, as it was very sweet in that specific sense. And I really don't know what the notes they have listed on here are, mostly because I couldn't access any information about this coffee other than what the coffee vine had. So I really don't know too much about it, but what I do know is that that sugary aspect was something that I was experiencing throughout with this one. Sweetness level 4. So this was very sweet coffee, and I'm very happy with that, as some people have alluded to Asian coffee roasters being a little bit more on the sweet side in general, and that was definitely the case with this one, as I was very pleased with just how much of that sugary caramelized sweetness was present within it. Not too much of the fruit sweetness, but I was more than okay with the other sweeter factors coming from this one. Acidity level 4, and that's one of the other things I did highlight, as this one did have a fair bit of brightness throughout the entirety of it, and I continue to mention it had that slightly, I want to say, pear-like brightness to it, in addition to that citric aspect to it, as it was a little bit more of like a citric zest quality, and that's what justified it scoring there at that level 4 mark. We move on to the citrus fruit, also there at that level 4, and I did mention that briefly, that it had a little bit of that citric zest sort of quality to it as well, and at times I would say a little bit more of a lemon water, given that this coffee was just a little bit more delicate. Wasn't necessarily the sweetest side of the coffee, as that was more on the sugary side of things, but outside of that I was actually quite pleased with the citric component of it, because it did give it a little bit more than just the very sugary forward cup. Caramel level 4, and I could kind of describe that as being a little bit more of a brown candy, generic sort of caramelized aspect, and I think the best way to describe it is maybe like a caramelized sugariness to it. So that one right there being one of the more prominent and pronounced factors within this coffee, it definitely justified itself at that level 4. A couple of level 3s, and we will start with the florality level 3. And I think that goes along the lines of the savoriness as well, because it did have a little bit of, I would say, like a tea-like florality. And I believe that they might have had something along the lines of a matcha listed on here, I think on the Coffee Vine's website, and that made a lot of sense, because there was a little bit of that sort of tea-like savoriness within this one. Stone fruit level 3, and that's one thing that I didn't mention too much with this coffee, as that's alluding to a more sugary stone fruit. So I could say something along the lines of a white peach. I think that's a little bit more apt for this coffee, as it definitely had more of those sugary aspects even within the fruit sense itself. Final thing worth discussing, body level 2, and I think that might have been impacted by brewing this one with the Chemex, as it wasn't necessarily the heaviest bodied cup of coffee, but it did have a little bit more of a lighter profiled theme to it in that regard. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. Alright, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I was quite pleased with how it turned out, as I really did not know what to expect from this one going into it. And then from the first impression I said, okay, this coffee has already exceeded my expectations, and for the entirety of it I continue to enjoy it, mostly because it did skew in a direction that I really seem to enjoy for a lot of these coffees, especially we'll say Central American coffees that have a lighter profile to them, like Honduran coffees, as I can safely say that this is one of my favorite Honduran coffees that we've reviewed this year, and that's very exciting. I think a lot of that had to do with the things that I'm looking for the most in every coffee: clarity, sweetness, and while it was lacking a little bit in the florality and it didn't necessarily have the most intense fruit component, I could feel like the other two made up for it, as it really seemed to offer just some wonderful sugary aspects within this one, lending itself towards being one of the more enjoyable Honduran coffees I've had this year. Type of person that would suggest this coffee to: first place I have to start is the lighter profile to it, because this one was definitely a little bit lighter than I think a lot of people might expect, but don't have too much familiarity with the Chinese coffee scene, so I assume that maybe a lot more of the coffee roasters are like this as well. In addition to that, the sweetness, because this one was a little bit more on the sweeter forward side of things, most specifically in the sugary direction, but it did have some nice depth as well. Slight bit of tea-like aspects, slight bit of citric components, and then in addition to that, a little bit more depth in the fruit profile with a little bit more of a sugary fruit aspect to it as well. I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed, This right here has been a review of the Laurel wash processed Honduras from Terraform Coffee Roasters. Thank you for watching.